The Citizens Coalition for Change leader in Zimbabwe, Nelson Chamisa, says the irregular manner in which the elections were conducted must be resolved. This comes after the country's Electoral Commission declared ZANU-PF's Emmerson Mnangagwa the winner of the country's presidential poll. He secured almost 53% of the vote to Chamisa's 44%, but international observers suspect vote rigging. Chamisa has called for electoral reforms to permanently address the issue. Let's unpack the story now. We're joined this morning by political analyst in Harare, Kudakwashe Manjonjo. It's great to talk to you. And I suppose the big question this morning, and it was always going to be in the wake of a result like this one, is was this election result a foregone conclusion?
Hi, Michelle. I think, first of all, it's never a foregone conclusion in any election. But the question was, why did people believe that this was a foregone conclusion? And I think it's basically the history of Zimbabwe elections where it's always expected that there's some form of rigging within our process. And that's always been a challenge for most of the Zimbabwe elections. So that is now what we're now going through again, which is essentially a lot of arguments over the process that led to the actual voting day, what happened over the voting day, and even then the authenticity and the independence of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission.
Yeah. The court challenge that will surely now take place gives us a bit of a sense of deja vu. It's what happened in 2018 as well. But back then, the court rejected Nelson Chamisa's approach insofar as questioning the election results. What do you reckon will happen this time round?
So as far as the way I understand it, if you look between 2018 and 2023, the main issue that arose, at least in terms of the argument that opposition brought across, was that they did not have what we call V11s, which are essentially the documentation that is taken at every polling station that registers the amount of votes. At this time, the CCC leader, Nelson Chamisa, has argued that they have all the V11s that they need, and they are going to be using that as evidence, and they are going to take it to court. The main argument that he put across was that the V11s that they have were very different from the ones that were used by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. Now, the question that the courts will have to deal with is that how do we get to a situation like this where essentially, and if you just allow me to explain the process, is that every V11 has to be signed by all the agents at every single polling station. So, for example, there would have to be an agent from ZANU-PF, from CCC, as well as from the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. And all these V11s, which add up to about 12,400 across the country, are then collated into one station, which is the national station. So now the question now that is arising is that how does CCC have different numbers compared to what ZEC produced 2 days ago? And that will be the question I think the courts will have to deal with. So because of that, this might actually be a different situation to 2018, because 2018, if you remember correctly, we did not get to the point where the V11s were actually produced. So that's one critical difference in terms of what might be produced. That's what we are assuming will be produced if there is a court action.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that we had all of those election observers in prison as well in the wake of Zimbabweans going to the polls. These are observers who do the job of the elections as they would do it in any other democratic process, right? They have their data. They are putting together their own projections of the results. You know, under what law would they have been arrested?
There is no law for anyone to be arrested for observing a mission. And what I'll do, I'll speak towards the main issue that's been brought across is what SADC said about the Zimbabwe election. So Zimbabwe, which is privy and very much part of the SADC protocol, accepted, it should be circa 2015-2016, to the SADC guidelines for elections. And these election guidelines really outline that observers, both local and international, have full independence to look at the election however they see fit and to document however they see fit. Mm-hmm. So now the question is, why did ZANU-PF, in this case ZANU-PF as the government at that point, and they still control the security forces, see it necessary to ensure that the two main non-governmental organizations that have been involved in collecting data for all the past elections had to be arrested? Which then brings us back to the point we've been making, is that there are questions over the validity of the numbers that were produced by ZEC. Because the question now will be, if CCC are seeing different numbers, the local observers were supposedly going to see different numbers, because they were going to be calling for what the local observers that were arrested were going to be doing. They were going to be announcing parallel results alongside what ZEC was going to be doing, which happens across any election process that happens between South Africa, Zambia, United States, the UK. So the question is, why do they see it very necessary to arrest local observers who have been doing this for all the previous elections? And again, it brings us back to the issue. Are the numbers as authentic as they say they are?
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about SADC and its response to the elections. Serious statements being made by SADC that the elections didn't comply with either regional or international standards. Are you expecting this morning, Kudakwashe, that other countries on the continent will also come out strongly, and perhaps South Africa in particular, given the very close relationship? Essentially, what happens in Zimbabwe has a direct impact on our country here.
Do I expect something? And I think I'll start with South Africa. I do not. And it's for a very simple reason. ANC and ZANU-PF are brothers at the bone. I think we've underestimated the relationship between these two liberation parties for too long, and how desperate they are to keep power. We also have to remember that ANC are going into an election very soon, and they will need also SADC support in case they go below 50%. We're not saying that the elections will not be as authentic as the Zimbabwe election, but what I do see is that ANC will be garnering and looking for support from all angles. If you see what Fikile Mbalula said, I think it should be last week, and actually generally speaking over the last 3 months, the overt support for ZANU-PF, even though they know that ZANU-PF is the main reason for the serious immigration crisis that's currently in South Africa, is shocking to say the least. And on top of that, one could argue that ANC actually wants the Zimbabwe crisis to carry on like this, not only for economic benefits, but also for political benefits. It's worrying that we might see Zimbabweans and general foreigners in South Africa being one of the top 3 issues coming to next year's elections. And because of that, there will be a scapegoat that ANC will use to essentially drive fear into a big block of the electorate in South Africa. And from that, they'll use that as a way to actually retain the 50% majority that they desperately need. So South Africa is disappointing, but as long as ANC is in power, I do not see that. Across the rest of the region, though, I think Zambia, because of the new president that came through about 2 years ago, that's why we saw a harder stance from SADC. This Mr. Hichilema is one of the first opposition leaders, the true opposition leaders that actually come through over the last 10 years. And because of that, they're really trying to push a stronger democratic force in countries that have got historical autocratic parties in power. And that's why we see SADC coming out so strongly. The rest of the AU, I don't think they focused as much as would have liked. We see the Niger crisis. West Africa definitely not going to be involved. And generally speaking, East Africa has not been as involved. So our hope really will be South Africa, and hopefully the opposition parties come through to really have a firm stance on the Zimbabwe crisis, and to really try to put ANC into a corner to ensure that at the very least, we're not saying they should support ZANU-PF, but they should be as neutral as possible. And that might be something supportive to at least see the true results that we're expecting to see from this election. You know,
you talk about the electorate, and I suppose that's a way to gauge, or one way to gauge any election, right, and the election outcomes. What's happening on the streets of Zimbabwe in the wake of ZANU-PF being declared the winner here? Are we seeing the kind of celebration that certainly the days leading up to the election talked about? There was excitement going into the polls, a lot of young people voting for the first time, talking about the fact that they are excited to vote for change. Did that translate when the election results were announced?
I'll have to be fair in the analysis here and say that it depends which side you voted for, right? So how I look at this, the urban vote definitely was very disappointed. There was a lot of voter suppression, and what we mean by that some polling stations only opened 4 or 5 hours after the 7 a.m. start that they were supposed to be. So in the urban areas, there's a lot of despondency. In the rural areas, I would say the word is not happiness, where most of ZANU-PF supporters, there is relief. And what I mean by that is that there have been a lot of accusations, some which I saw personally, of an association called the Forever Associates Zimbabwe, FAZ, that came through, and they were intimidating during the voting process that was happening across most of the rural areas. So the relief that is happening in the rural areas is mainly based on the relief that there has not been a lot of violence. And I think that's what we're feeling. So because of what you said earlier, that this seems like this is always happening in Zimbabwe elections, for a lot of rural votes, as long as they don't get to a violent result that happened in the 2008 election and the 2002 election, this is a moment of relief for them. But are we seeing anything violent, any happiness? I do not see that happening at all, unless you're very much directly involved in the election. And what I mean by that, unless you're an MP or councillor for ZANU-PF, and of course, those who are part of the political economy benefiting from a ZANU-PF win.
Kudakwashe Manjonjo, let me thank you for your time this morning. Political analyst talking to us there in the wake of the Zimbabwe elections being declared.